Mr. President, I come to the floor this morning to give the first of what may turn out to be many speeches on a subject that affects every single American. The question is the rising cost of prescription drugs in this country. And the first drug that I wanted to address, I wanted to choose carefully because I wanted to choose a drug that really is important to the largest number of Americans. So I thought to myself, what is the most commonly used life or death drug in America today? There's some debate about it, but I'm going to suggest that it's insulin. In 1923, almost 100 years ago, researchers were awarded the Nobel Prize for the groundbreaking discovery of insulin to treat diabetes. 1923. The chief scientist in the discovery was Dr. Frederick Banting. He believed that insulin should be accessible to everyone. His team sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1 so that, quote, no one could secure a profitable monopoly, close quote, on the production of insulin. That might seem hard to believe today, with the price of insulin having increased more than 600% over the past 2 decades. Take a look at the chart, which maps the increases in price. Eli Lilly's blockbuster insulin drug, Humalog, introduced in 1996 at a cost of $21. By 2019, the cost is $329. Sanofi's Lantus. It was $35 when it came to the market in 2001. It now costs $270. The insulin drug Novo Nordisk Novolog, $40 in 2001. By 2018, $289 for insulin. How many Americans are affected by this? Well, there are 30 million Americans who live with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, almost 10% of our population. Approximately 7.5 million of them rely on insulin to manage their blood sugar levels. It's a matter of life and death. Yet patients are suffering because of these dramatic price spikes. A recent study found that 1/4 of patients who rely on insulin have been forced to ration their doses due to cost, basically in contravention of the advice of their doctors. The story which many of us have heard here. Last year, we heard from the mother of Alec Rayshawn Smith. He went off his mom's health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. He can remain covered until he reaches the age of 26. He had diabetes. He had coverage for his insulin until he reached the age of 26. Then he couldn't afford to buy health insurance. And so when he went off that insurance, he was faced with the monthly cost of his insulin out of pocket. That monthly cost was $1,000 each month. He managed a little restaurant, and he couldn't come up with $1,000. So he decided that he would ration his insulin and not take as much as was required by his doctor, trying to make it last between paychecks. Alec died as a result of that decision. How is it in the richest country on earth, patients are having to ration their insulin, start GoFundMe websites just to survive? Insulin was a cure found in the 20th century that patients now cannot afford in the 21st century. Pharma's war on patients with diabetes must come to an end. Yesterday, there was a hearing, widely televised, where 7 or 8 of the CEOs of major pharmaceutical companies faced the music before the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Grassley, Senator Wyden, and many others asked questions about the issue I'm raising today. What is going on? Why are you raising prices so high? There were no good answers coming from these executives. Today I'm going to start highlighting on the floor of the Senate the egregious cases of pharmaceutical greed in the United States. Years ago, There was a senator from Wisconsin named William Proxmire. He was an unusual man. He was far different than most senators today. He was the type of fellow who would show up at University of Wisconsin games, passing out cards, and that was his style of campaigning. He didn't spend a lot of money on television and radio. He really was a grassroots politician, and he was a tenacious fellow. And he started something called the Golden Fleece Award, Proxmire of Wisconsin's Golden Fleece Award. And once every month or more, he would come to the floor and talk about waste, taxpayer waste in our federal government. It developed a national reputation. Well, I'm going to, in deference to Senator Proxmire, whom I had a chance to meet when I was a college student, I'm going to try to follow in his tradition by pointing out egregious examples of greed by the pharmaceutical industry in the United States on a regular basis with the Pharma Fleece Award. My first Pharma Fleece Award is for the pharmaceutical industry's extortion of 7.5 million diabetic patients who depend on insulin in America. This is a life-saving product that's been around for almost a century. How can the most common life and death drug be so expensive? Well, first off, the United States is an outlier. The same companies I'm talking about sell exactly the same drug in other countries around the world for a fraction of the cost. The United States represents only 15% of all the global insulin market, yet we generate more than 50% of pharma's revenue for this drug. How can Lantus cost $372 in the United States? The exact same drug made by the same company cost $46 in France, $67 in Canada. Why? Why are we paying 5, 6, 7 times more in the United States for exactly the same drug? Because the governments of France and Canada care about the cost. And they say to Lantus, they say to the company, Sanofi in this case, that makes Lantus, if you want to sell Lantus in Canada, we're not going to let you kite the prices and raise them to the high heavens. We're going to keep the prices reasonable so the people of Canada can afford this life-saving drug. What do we do in the United States? Nothing. We let them charge whatever they wish. How can Lantus cost $372 for Americans while the same exact drug for the French is $46 and just across the border in Canada, $67? Our problem is that our system doesn't function as a free market. There is virtually no competition. 3 companies control the insulin supply in America: Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk. Typically in a free market, 3 competitors would lower the prices, wouldn't they? But in America, these 3 charge as much as they can and get away with it because they are protected by government-granted monopolies. We should reward innovation, we should promote research, and we should ensure that companies do make a profit for their good work. But abusive manufacturers should not be protected from competition by our government. Lantus has been on the market since the year 2000. Sanofi has received 49 secondary patents on the insulin. What does that mean? They've created a fortress around this lucrative drug for a 37-year monopoly in offering this drug for sale in America. Unfortunately, there's no effective deterrent today against Big Pharma's greed and price gouging on these and so many other drugs. That's why earlier this month I introduced a bill called the Forcing Limits on Abusive and Tumultuous Prices, or Flat Price Act. This legislation will discourage and deter the pharmaceutical industry from raising prices by reducing their government monopoly periods when they do. You see, companies are awarded monopoly periods from 5 to 12 years by the Food and Drug Administration for drug approval, beyond the patent protection. My Flat Prices Act would reduce this FDA-granted exclusivity period for a drug whose price increases more than 10% a year, bringing generic competitors into the marketplace, creating real competition and trying to lower prices for Americans. That brings us to another issue. Today, there remains no generic, no biosimilar insulin that can be substituted at a pharmacy. Think about it. Almost a century after the discovery of human insulin, and even half a century after the discovery of synthetic and analog insulin, we still don't have a generic insulin for sale in America that is affordable. These changes in insulin have improved the quality of life for patients, I will acknowledge. They've made them safer, more effective, and more convenient. But these changes have delayed the development of generic substitutes. The other reason is that FDA has regulated insulin as a drug rather than as a biologic, placing insulin under a framework with a much higher bar for generics to prove their substitutes. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, the Food and Drug Administration is supposed to be shifting its regulatory process for insulin to enable copycat versions known as biosimilars to be approved quickly. Unfortunately, FDA's plan to implement this law won't bring relief to patients anytime soon. I do believe that the Food and Drug Administration Commissioner, Dr. Gottlieb, truly wants to lower costs and spur competition. I wasn't convinced when his nomination came up for a vote, but I've had subsequent conversations with him, and I think he's genuine. I think he wants to see the prices come down. However, the Food and Drug Administration's current plan will effectively freeze the approval process for lower-cost insulin and force generic insulin makers who are under review to resubmit their new applications each year. This creates a 2-year lockout where it's unlikely any new insulin competitors will come to market. America's patients, diabetic patients, cannot wait. That's why Senator Kramer, Republican of North Dakota, and I are sending a letter urging the Food and Drug Administration to revise and bring flexibility to this process so we can get the lower-cost insulin on the market approved sooner. 2 weeks ago, I received a little note from a constituent in Mount Vernon, Illinois. That's downstate, near where my father was born. He wrote that both he and his daughter had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 1997. At that time, their Humalog insulin cost $10. Today, he writes that it costs $300 a bottle, and he needs 6 bottles a month. His costs have risen, monthly cost, from $600 to $1,800. Here's what he said in his letter. At some point, drug companies must be held to account for the actions they are taking. Their cost increases are causing American citizens to choose between insulin and eating in many cases. I'm tired of listening to all the excuses. What is it going to take for Congress to do its job? I agree with my constituent. Congress needs to step up and demand real change. The sky-high cost of life or death insulin is literally killing Americans. My work with Senator Kramer to speed FDA approval of lower-cost insulin and my bill to shorten monopolies for abusive pharma companies are a start. This pharma fleecing of insulin patients across America must end. Mr. President, I yield the floor.